Welcome to the History AI podcast, where the past comes alive with facts, anecdotes, and a dash of humor. Here are your hosts, Chuck and Marco.
Welcome back, everyone, to the History AI podcast. I'm Chuck, and with me as always is my little brother Marco.
Hey folks! Glad to have you back with us. Today, we're diving into a fascinating yet not so well-known Cold War experiment known as Operation LAC.
You know, Marco, sometimes these experiments leave me scratching my head. Operation LAC, what the heck is it?
Well, Chuck, today's episode is all about getting into the nuts and bolts of Operation Large Area Coverage. Buckle up, folks, because we're talking about a government experiment that makes science fiction look tame. Let's turn back the clock to the mid-20th century. It's the mid-1950s, and the Cold War isn't just a political standoff, it's a palpable part of everyday life. The US and Soviet Union are locked in a fierce battle for global supremacy, not just with weapons, but with ideology.
Right, Marco. And this fear isn't abstract. People are genuinely worried about nuclear annihilation. It's an era where kids are doing duck-and-cover drills in schools, and families are building fallout shelters in their backyards.
Exactly, Chuck. And it's not just the nuclear threat. There's a real worry about other forms of warfare, like biological attacks. The US government is thinking about how to protect its population against an invisible enemy that could be silently unleashed.
And that's where Operation LAC comes into the picture. The US isn't just playing defense. They're actively testing how they might respond to these threats, which leads to some pretty controversial decisions.
Indeed, Chuck. Operation LAC, or Large Area Coverage, was born out of this environment. The military's goal was to understand how a biological or chemical agent would disperse across large geographical areas, affecting both urban and rural populations.
It sounds like a science fiction scenario, but this was very real for the folks back then. The stakes were high, and the fear of the unknown was a powerful motivator for these tests.
And amidst this backdrop of fear and preparation, Operation LAC would unfold as one of the most extensive and secretive tests the US military would ever conduct on its own soil, raising ethical and health questions that are still discussed today.
It's a story of protection wrapped in fear, and it sets the stage for everything that follows in our exploration of Operation LAC. So, stay tuned as we unpack the details of this clandestine operation.
Operation LAC, which stands for Large Area Coverage, was the culmination of a growing concern among US military strategists how to defend against a potential biological warfare attack. The objectives were straightforward yet chilling: to test the feasibility of dispersing a simulated biological agent over massive geographic regions.
And to do that, they needed to find a substance that would mimic the spread of harmful pathogens without actually harming the public.
Correct. They settled on zinc cadmium sulfide, a compound the military deemed safe. Its small particle size and fluorescent properties made it easy to track and study. The idea was that by spraying it over vast areas, they could model how biological agents might disperse if released by an enemy.
The military had to make sure they had the right technology to cover a large area with these particles. That's why they used specially modified aircraft that could spray the particles at high altitudes.
These were mainly Fairchild C-119 flying boxcar planes, which could release the particles in steady streams, allowing them to be carried by prevailing winds. They flew at different altitudes, from a few hundred feet to several thousand, to study how particle behavior varied with elevation.
But it wasn't just aircraft. They also set up ground-based monitoring stations and mobile units to track the particles. They wanted to map out exactly how far and wide the particles could travel and understand the patterns of deposition.
They collected data meticulously, measuring how the particles settled over rural and urban environments. They chose specific cities like Minneapolis and St. Louis due to their contrasting geographic and climatic conditions, providing valuable insight into how biological agents might behave in different types of communities.
And there was a rationale for choosing these cities, wasn't there?
Definitely. St. Louis was densely populated and surrounded by suburbs, while Minneapolis was colder and less congested. By testing in both locations, the military could study how different environments influence the spread of these particles.
It was a massive experiment. But they weren't just tracking how far the particles went, right?
No, they were also gathering data on particle density to simulate how a biological agent's potency might change with distance. They wanted to know whether an attack in one part of the country could have an impact several states away.
That's ambitious, but it raises serious questions about the ethics of conducting this kind of experimentation on an unsuspecting population.
It sure does. And those questions about health and safety would only grow louder in the years to come. Operation LAC, as part of the military's wider testing initiative, took place primarily between 1957 and 1958. But to fully understand the timeline, we need to look back a little further. Prior to Operation LAC, the US military had already conducted several localized tests using zinc-cadmium sulfide, particularly around populated urban centers like New York City and San Francisco.
And those early tests were smaller scale, right?
Exactly. They wanted to understand the behavior of particles in specific environments before scaling up to the large area coverage approach. In 1957, when Operation LAC formally kicked off, the military began by deploying C-119 flying boxcars to spray the substance from high altitudes over areas like Minneapolis, St. Louis, and other regions across the Midwest and South.
Let's break down how they executed it, Marco. They didn't just do one big spray, did they?
Not at all. The operation was methodical. Between December 1957 and the spring of 1958, they conducted a series of separate tests. Each test involved a carefully planned flight path where they would release a concentrated amount of zinc-cadmium sulfide at varying altitudes.
And they specifically timed these flights to take advantage of certain weather conditions?
That's right. Weather played a crucial role. The military wanted to conduct tests during times when the air currents would best carry the particles across entire states. In some instances, these releases were planned to see how far the particles could travel under the influence of strong prevailing winds.
What did that mean for the distribution pattern?
Well, because of the precise planning and reliance on wind patterns, the particles from one test could travel hundreds of miles and fall lightly over multiple states. For example, particles released over the Midwest were later detected as far away as the East Coast.
Incredible. Were there any areas where they focused more heavily?
Definitely. The areas around Minneapolis and St. Louis received higher concentrations due to their urban population densities. These cities became focal points for testing because their populations would yield more useful data on how agents might affect a diverse cross-section of people.
How many flights did they conduct over these areas?
The exact number varies based on the source, but it's estimated that over 200 individual flights took place during the operation, each spraying thousands of pounds of zinc-cadmium sulfide into the atmosphere.
That's a lot of particles, Marco. Did they face any logistical challenges?
Absolutely. The sheer coordination required was immense. They had to organize flight paths carefully, set up ground monitoring stations across multiple states, and ensure the dispersal was consistent for accurate data collection.
Operation LAC certainly required an ambitious timeline and coordination effort. And after the final flights in 1958, the military then had to analyze all that data.
Yes, they spent years reviewing the findings. They sought to use this data to inform future biological defense strategies, even though the secrecy around the operation would lead to growing public scrutiny.
Now, Marco, let's dive into the impact and controversies that followed Operation LAC. What did the aftermath of these extensive tests look like?
In the immediate aftermath, the public remained largely unaware that these tests had even occurred. The military had kept Operation LAC under wraps, viewing it as vital national security research. When reports eventually emerged in the 1970s, there was an uproar over the lack of consent and transparency.
And rightly so. People were understandably concerned. Did the government downplay the potential risks?
Yes, they did. Officials maintained that zinc-cadmium sulfide was harmless, claiming that the compound didn't pose a significant health risk to humans or animals. But this reassurance didn't sit well with many scientists or the general public, given the composition of cadmium, which was already known to have carcinogenic properties.
So, people started connecting the dots and suspecting that the government hadn't been fully honest?
Exactly. The controversy snowballed as people began to notice unusual health patterns in their communities. Some residents in Minneapolis and St. Louis reported respiratory issues, skin rashes, and other ailments. Although the government denied direct links between these health issues and the zinc-cadmium sulfide exposure, public trust in government experiments was significantly shaken.
And this wasn't just a few individuals, right?
No, Chuck. Entire communities were upset. People worried about long-term exposure risks, especially for children and those with pre-existing conditions. In the years that followed, independent studies were conducted to assess the potential health impacts. The findings were inconclusive but did raise questions about cadmium's role in the exposure.
Meanwhile, lawmakers and watchdog groups demanded answers.
True. It became a matter of public accountability. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, there were calls for investigations, which led to congressional hearings to understand the full scope of the operation. These hearings brought to light a lack of oversight in government-led experiments.
It must have been a wake-up call for future military testing.
Absolutely. The controversy surrounding Operation LAC ultimately helped shape future policies, reinforcing the need for stricter ethical guidelines and transparency. No longer could the military conduct such experiments in secret without considering the public's safety.
It's amazing how these past operations set the stage for today's protocols.
Indeed. While we can't undo the mistakes of the past, we can ensure that government experiments today adhere to higher ethical standards. Operation LAC remains a crucial case study on the impact of secret testing on public health and trust. When Operation LAC came to light in the 1970s, it wasn't just a story of experimentation and secrecy. It was also a story of heroism and the power of relentless citizens demanding accountability.
Let's talk about those heroes, Marco. Who were the key figures that fought for transparency?
A lot of credit goes to the investigative journalists and watchdog organizations that wouldn't let this story die. Their relentless pursuit of the truth and commitment to exposing government overreach forced the military to come clean. One of these journalists was Seymour Hersh, a reporter who pushed for more information in the face of government stonewalling.
I can't imagine it was easy to break this story. The military must have been less than forthcoming.
Absolutely. But the reporters were undeterred. They filed Freedom of Information Act requests, sought insider sources, and combed through public documents to reveal the breadth of the experiments. Their reporting brought Operation LAC into public consciousness and helped rally support for further investigation.
But it wasn't just journalists.
No, activists and local community leaders played a crucial role. In cities like St. Louis and Minneapolis, community organizers worked tirelessly to gather testimonies, document illnesses, and petition their representatives to demand action. They refused to be silenced, standing up for their neighbors and the rights of future generations.
It's a testament to the power of grassroots organizing. Did their efforts eventually lead to action in Washington?
Yes, they did. Their persistence led to congressional hearings in the late 1970s and early 1980s, where the military had to publicly answer for their actions. These hearings revealed more details about Operation LAC and other similar projects, prompting stricter regulations around government experimentation.
What did these regulations include?
New policies emphasized transparency, requiring greater oversight and ethical standards. Informed consent became a baseline requirement for studies involving potentially hazardous materials. Furthermore, civilian oversight boards were established to review and approve testing protocols.
So in a sense, those communities ensured no one else would have to endure secret experimentation again.
Exactly, Chuck. Their efforts reshaped how the U.S. approaches testing, making sure that the public has a seat at the table and that government accountability is prioritized.
Operation LAC remains a stark reminder of how secrecy can harm the public, but it's also a story of heroism, of everyday people stepping up and demanding better.
A legacy that shows we can hold our institutions accountable, even when they try to operate in the shadows.
And that wraps up our dive into Operation LAC. Thanks for joining us for this enlightening episode of the History AI podcast.
If you found today's exploration fascinating, help us spread the word. Share this episode with your friends, family, and anyone you think would love to learn about these hidden chapters of history.
A 5-star review really makes a difference too. Your reviews help us reach more curious minds and allow us to continue bringing you these intriguing stories.
And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode. Each one is evergreen, so you can come back anytime and revisit your favorite moments.
Got a historical topic you'd love us to explore? Let us know through social media or in the review section. We're always on the lookout for fascinating stories.
Oh, and one more thing, we've got brand new merch available. Check out the link in the show notes to rep the History AI podcast.
So, until next time, keep sharing, keep learning, and as always, stay curious. Looking for the perfect way to show appreciation for the incredible mom in your life? Discover Exhausted Moms, a coloring journey to relaxation and humor, the coloring book that speaks directly to the heart of motherhood. Gift her an escape into pages of laughter, empowerment, and moments of tranquility. With Exhausted Moms, she'll find a blend of whimsical illustrations and inspiring quotes that celebrate her daily triumphs and challenges. Crafted with love from images I created for the mother of my children, each page offers a space for creativity and relaxation, a reminder that she's doing an amazing job, even on the toughest days. Give the gift of laughter, peace, and recognition. Exhausted Moms isn't just a coloring book, it's a hug, a nod of understanding, and a token of appreciation for everything she does. Surprise her with Exhausted Moms today and watch her face light up with joy. Because every mom deserves a moment to herself, wrapped in the colors of love and support.